June 13, 1942. Amagansett Beach, Long Island, New York. 4 men in German naval uniforms step out of an inflatable raft and onto American soil. Their boots sink into wet sand. Behind them, the Atlantic Ocean churns in darkness. Above them, fog rolls thick and heavy. One of the men turns back toward the water, watching a German U-boat, U-202, disappear beneath black waves. In his pocket, he carries $83,000 in cash and instructions to destroy America from within. His name is George John Dash, and in 48 hours, he will make a decision that changes everything. But let's back up. Because to understand what happens next, you need to understand how desperate Germany had become. By the summer of 1942, Hitler's war machine was locked in a death struggle on 2 fronts. In Russia, the Wehrmacht was bleeding out in brutal combat. In the Atlantic, German submarines hunted Allied convoys, but couldn't stop the flow of American guns, tanks, and aircraft pouring into Britain. The United States had been in the war for only 6 months, but American industry was already beginning to tip the scales. Factories in Detroit built tanks, shipyards in California launched destroyers, steel mills in Pennsylvania ran 24 hours a day. Hitler needed to slow this juggernaut, and he couldn't do it from across the ocean. He needed people on the inside. He needed saboteurs. The plan was called Operation Pastorius, named after the first German settlement in America. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, personally approved it. The mission was simple in concept, but devastating in scope. Land 2 teams of trained saboteurs on American beaches, give them explosives, cash, and targets, then let them disappear into American society and wage a secret war. They would blow up hydroelectric plants that powered aluminum factories. They would destroy railroad bridges that carried war materials. They would sabotage the Hell Gate Bridge in New York, cutting off a vital supply line. They would strike fear into the American public and prove that nobody was safe, not even in the heartland. The men chosen for this mission weren't typical soldiers. They were something far more dangerous. They were German Americans, men who had lived in the United States for years, who spoke perfect English, who knew American customs and could blend in seamlessly. George Dash had worked as a waiter in New York. Ernst Berger had been a naturalized American citizen before returning to Germany. Herbert Haupt grew up in Chicago. Edward Curling had lived in the States for over a decade. These men understood America in ways that regular German soldiers never could. They knew which diners served the best coffee. They knew how Americans dressed, how they talked, how they moved through the world. They were ghosts before they even started. Training took place at a sabotage school near Berlin. For weeks, the men learned how to make bombs from everyday materials. They studied American railroads and power grids. They memorized cover stories and learned how to move without being noticed. The instructors were thorough, almost obsessive. Every detail mattered. Every mistake could mean death. The men practiced building timing devices that could delay explosions for hours or even days. They learned which industrial targets were most vulnerable. They studied maps of New York, Chicago, and other major cities until they could navigate them blindfolded. And then came the money. $84,000 was divided among the 8 saboteurs, about $1.3 million in today's currency. The bills were authentic American currency, collected from various sources and carefully prepared. The men also received German uniforms to wear during the landing. This detail was crucial. If they were captured immediately while wearing uniforms, they could claim to be prisoners of war under international law. But once they changed into civilian clothes, they became spies. And spies, everyone knew, faced execution. So on that foggy night in June, George Dash and his 3 companions, Ernst Berger, Heinrich Heinck, and Richard Quirin, climbed into a rubber raft and paddled toward Long Island. The submarine couldn't get too close to shore. The water was too shallow and the risk of detection too high. The men rowed through darkness and mist, knowing that everything depended on the next few hours. If they could get inland and change into civilian clothes, they would vanish into America's vast landscape. But first, they had to make it off the beach. They dragged the raft onto sand and began burying their equipment. Explosives wrapped in waterproof containers, detonators, fuses, everything they needed to wage war. They worked quickly, their hands moving in practiced efficiency. Dash kept glancing at his watch. They had maybe an hour before sunrise, maybe less. That's when Ernst Berger noticed the fog starting to lift. That's when they heard footsteps. A young man emerged from the darkness, walking the beach patrol. His name was John Cullen, and he was a 21-year-old Coast Guardsman from a nearby station. He wasn't expecting trouble. The beaches had been quiet for months, but something made him approach these men anyway. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was training. Maybe it was just bad luck. Cullen walked up and asked what they were doing. Dash's mind raced. Everything they had planned, everything they had trained for, now came down to this moment. He could see his companions reaching for weapons. He could feel the weight of his own pistol. One shot would eliminate the problem, but would also raise an alarm that would bring the entire military down on them. So Dash made a choice. He stepped forward, his voice calm and confident, speaking English with just a hint of an accent. He told Cullen they were fishermen. Their boat had run aground in the fog. They were just trying to get back to town. Cullen didn't buy it. He asked more questions. He moved closer. That's when he saw the crates in the sand. That's when he noticed the men were wearing strange clothing that didn't quite fit the story. Dash saw Cullen's suspicion growing, saw the young guardsman's hand moving toward his flashlight. Time slowed down. In that frozen moment, Dash made another decision. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a roll of bills, and pressed it into Cullen's hand. $260. He leaned close and spoke quietly. You never saw us. Forget this happened. Take your family out for a good time. Cullen looked at the money. He looked at the four men. He was young, alone, and outnumbered. He took the money and walked away, but he didn't go far. As soon as he was out of sight, he ran. He ran back to his station and sounded the alarm. Within minutes, Coast Guard personnel were mobilizing. But by then, Dash and his team had finished burying their equipment and changed into civilian clothes. They walked off the beach and caught the Long Island Railroad into New York City, looking like four businessmen heading to work. The most audacious German military operation on American soil had just begun. Or had it? Because something happened to George Dash during that encounter on the beach. Maybe it was seeing Cullen's young face. Maybe it was the realization that he was now committed to a path that would end in blood and terror. Maybe it was something that had been growing in him for weeks. Dash had been having doubts. He had lived in America for 19 years before returning to Germany. He had friends here. He had memories here. He knew these people. And now he was supposed to kill them. The Abwehr had chosen him because he understood America, but understanding cut both ways. He didn't just know how to blend in. He knew what he would be destroying. The four men checked into the Governor Clinton Hotel in Manhattan. They had money, false identification papers, and a list of targets. They were supposed to wait a few days, scout their locations, and then begin operations. The second team, Edward Curling, Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer, and Herbert Haupt, had landed 4 days later near Jacksonville, Florida, and were making their way north. Everything was proceeding according to plan. But Dash couldn't sleep. He lay in his hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what came next. He thought about the factories full of workers, the bridges packed with commuters, the trains carrying civilians. This wasn't a battlefield. This was something else entirely. Ernst Berger was having similar thoughts. Berger had been arrested by the Gestapo in Germany and spent time in a concentration camp before being recruited for this mission. He had seen what the Nazi regime was capable of. He had seen the camps, the brutality, the absolute disregard for human life. He didn't want to be part of that anymore. On their second night in New York, Dash and Berger talked. They talked for hours, their voices low and urgent. Dash confessed what he had been thinking. He didn't want to go through with the mission. He wanted to turn himself in. He wanted to tell the Americans everything. Berger listened, and when Dash finished, Berger said he felt the same way. But both men knew what they were considering was more dangerous than the mission itself. If they failed to convince the Americans they were genuine defectors, they would be executed as spies. If word got back to Germany, their families would suffer. There was no safe path forward. But Dash had made up his mind. On June 14th, one day after landing on American soil, He picked up a telephone in his hotel room and called the FBI in New York. He asked to speak to J. Edgar Hoover. The agent who answered probably got dozens of crank calls every week, people claiming to have information, conspiracy theorists, attention seekers. So when Dash said he was a German saboteur who wanted to surrender, the agent was skeptical. Dash could hear it in the man's voice, the barely concealed dismissiveness. Dash tried to explain. He had information about a plot to destroy American industry. He had just arrived from Germany. He had explosives and money and a list of targets. The agent took his name and told him someone would look into it. Then the line went dead. Dash sat in his hotel room, staring at the phone, realizing he had just committed treason and nobody believed him. He decided to go to Washington. If the FBI in New York wouldn't listen, maybe headquarters would. He told Berger to stay in New York and keep the others from doing anything rash. Then he bought a train ticket and headed south. He checked into the Mayflower Hotel in Washington and called the FBI again. This time, he was more forceful. He demanded to speak to someone in authority. He used phrases he had learned in training that would signal he was serious. He mentioned Operation Pastorius by name. He said he had information about U-boats and landing sites and targets across the country. This got attention. FBI agents agreed to meet him, but they still weren't sure if he was genuine or insane. On June 19th, Dash sat across from FBI agents and emptied his pockets onto a table. $84,000 in cash, maps, contact information, explosive components, the names and locations of his fellow saboteurs, everything. He talked for hours, describing the training facility in Germany, the submarine journey, the landing on Long Island, the encounter with Cullen. He drew diagrams of the explosive devices they had been taught to build. He listed potential targets with precise details. The agents listened, taking notes, their expressions shifting from skepticism to alarm. This wasn't a hoax. This was real. There were Nazi saboteurs loose in America, and one of them was sitting right in front of them, confessing everything. The FBI moved fast. Within days, agents had arrested all 8 saboteurs. They found Berger, Heinck, and Quirin in New York. They tracked down Curling and his team in Chicago and New York. The men had no idea they had been betrayed. They thought they were safe, blending into American society, preparing for their missions. Instead, they were rounded up like common criminals. The FBI seized their explosives, their money, their equipment. The investigation was thorough and devastating. Not a single element of Operation Pastorius would ever be carried out. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because the FBI didn't want to admit how they caught the saboteurs. If they revealed that Dash had voluntarily turned himself in, it would look like they had gotten lucky. It would undermine public confidence in the Bureau's ability to protect America. So they crafted a different narrative. They claimed they had been tracking the saboteurs from the moment they landed. They said John Cullen's report had triggered a brilliant investigation that led agents straight to the Spies. They made it sound like the FBI had never lost control of the situation. Dash's role was minimized, almost erased. He had been expecting gratitude, recognition, maybe even a reward. Instead, he found himself swept up in a political machine that needed heroes and villains, not complicated truths. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was furious when he learned about Operation Pastorius, not just because German saboteurs had landed on American beaches, but because it exposed vulnerabilities in coastal defenses. The public couldn't know how easily the Germans had come ashore. The military couldn't admit that 4 men in a rubber raft had breached American security without any resistance. So Roosevelt made a decision. The saboteurs would be tried before a military tribunal, not a civilian court. This was controversial. Some argued it violated constitutional protections. Defense lawyers tried to appeal to the Supreme Court. But Roosevelt was adamant these men were enemy combatants who had come to wage war on American soil. They would be judged as such. The trial took place in secret in a conference room in the Department of Justice building. 7 military officers served as judges. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: photographs of the buried equipment, testimony from Coast Guard officers, the saboteurs' own confessions. The defense tried to argue that the men had never actually committed sabotage, that they should be treated as prisoners of war. But the prosecutors countered that by landing in civilian clothes with the intent to commit sabotage, the men had forfeited any protection under international law. They were spies, pure and simple. And the penalty for espionage during wartime was death. All 8 men were found guilty. All 8 were sentenced to death by electric chair. The verdict was swift and unambiguous. But behind the scenes, Dash and Berger were lobbying for their lives. They argued that they had cooperated fully, that they had prevented the mission from succeeding, that they deserved leniency. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover supported this recommendation, though he was careful to maintain the public fiction that the Bureau had cracked the case through brilliant detective work. The final decision rested with President Roosevelt. On August 8, 1942, 6 of the saboteurs were executed at the District of Columbia Jail. They were electrocuted one by one, their bodies disposed of quietly. The executions were carried out with grim efficiency. The men had been in American custody for less than 2 months. From landing on American beaches to dying in electric chairs took just 56 days. It remains the fastest trial and execution of enemy agents in American history. The Speed sent a message. America would not tolerate attacks on its homeland. Anyone who tried would face swift and certain justice. Roosevelt commuted the sentences of Dash and Berger to prison time. Dash received 30 years. Berger received life imprisonment. They were sent to federal prison, where they would spend the next several years in obscurity. The American public never learned the full story of Dash's betrayal. In official accounts, he was just another captured spy who had cooperated to save his own skin. The truth, that he had prevented a potentially catastrophic sabotage campaign before it even started, remained classified for decades. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard officer who had first encountered the saboteurs, John Cullen, became a minor hero. He was praised for his vigilance and quick thinking. He received a commendation and a small promotion. The $260 Dash had given him was quietly forgotten. The narrative needed Cullen to be the alert guardian who spotted the threat, not the scared young man who had been bribed and let 4 enemy agents walk away. History is often cleaner than reality. But what about the equipment buried on the beach? Coast Guard personnel returned to Amagansett and dug up the waterproof containers. They found enough explosives to carry out dozens of attacks: TNT blocks, timing devices, fuses, incendiary materials. The men had also buried cigarettes, writing implements, and other items that would help them blend into American society. Every piece of equipment was cataloged and analyzed. Intelligence officers studied the German sabotage techniques, looking for patterns that might reveal other operations. The discovery convinced military planners that coastal security needed to be dramatically improved. Patrols were increased, surveillance was expanded. America's beaches would never be so vulnerable again. The story could have ended there. 8 saboteurs arrested, 6 executed, 2 imprisoned, threat eliminated. But the real tragedy was just beginning. Because George Dash would spend the rest of his life caught between 2 countries that both considered him a traitor. He served 6 years in federal prison before President Harry Truman commuted his sentence in 1948. He and Berger were deported to Germany, where they faced a hostile reception. Most Germans viewed them as cowards who had betrayed their comrades. The fact that they had prevented sabotage meant nothing. They had given up. They had talked. In German eyes, they were failures and traitors. Dash tried to rebuild his life. He moved to different German cities, trying to escape his past. He wrote letters to American officials, begging them to tell the truth about what he had done. He wanted recognition. He wanted people to know that he had made a choice, a difficult and dangerous choice that had saved lives. But the American government remained silent. The FBI files on Operation Pastorius were classified. The full story wouldn't be declassified until 1960, and even then, few people paid attention. Dash became a forgotten man, living in obscurity, watching history move on without him. He wrote a book in 1959 called 8 Spies Against America, trying to tell his side of the story. Few people read it. The reviews were skeptical. Some questioned whether his version of events was accurate. Others simply didn't care. The war was over. America had moved on to new threats, new enemies. The story of a German saboteur who had a change of heart seemed like a footnote, a curiosity from a bygone era. Dash struggled financially. He worked odd jobs. He lived modestly. He carried with him the knowledge that he had prevented what could have been a devastating campaign of terror, and nobody seemed to care. Ernst Berger fared no better. He returned to Germany and found work, but he was always marked by his past. He died in 1975, having spent decades living quietly, avoiding attention. The other survivors of the saboteur teams were dead. The executed men had been buried in unmarked graves. The entire operation had been swept into the dustbin of history, remembered only by historians and intelligence professionals. But here's what makes this story matter. Operation Pastorius was the most significant act of German aggression on American soil during World War II. If the saboteurs had succeeded, they could have set back American war production by months. They could have killed hundreds or thousands of people. They could have created a climate of fear and paranoia that would have affected civilian morale. And they were stopped not by brilliant FBI work, not by military vigilance, but by one man's conscience. George Dash looked at what he was about to do and decided he couldn't live with it. That decision, made in a hotel room in Manhattan, changed the course of events. The case established important legal precedents about how enemy combatants could be tried during wartime. The Supreme Court's decision in Ex parte Quirin upheld the use of military tribunals for enemy saboteurs, a ruling that would be cited decades later in the War on Terror. The speed and secrecy of the trial raised questions about due process that still resonate today. How much power should the executive branch have during wartime? When do security concerns outweigh constitutional protections? These debates continue, and they trace back to 8 German saboteurs and a secret trial in 1942. John Cullen lived a long life after the war. He rarely spoke about his encounter on the beach. When he did, he stuck to the official story, that he had been suspicious, that he had reported what he saw, that the FBI had taken it from there. He never mentioned the bribe. He never talked about being terrified and outnumbered. He became part of the mythology, the alert Coast Guardsman who spotted the threat. It was a simpler story, and sometimes simple stories are what history needs. The beach at Amagansett looks different now. It's a popular spot for tourists and locals. People walk their dogs there. Families build sandcastles. Surfers catch waves. A small marker notes that German saboteurs once landed there, but most people walk past it without stopping. The dramatic events of that foggy June night have faded into the background noise of history. But if you stand on that beach at night, when the fog rolls in and the ocean churns, you can almost imagine 4 men in a rubber raft, rowing toward shore, carrying explosives and $84,000 in cash, believing they were about to change the war. George Dash died in 1992 in Germany at the age of 89. He had spent 50 years trying to convince people that he had made the right choice, that he had been a hero, not a traitor. He died without ever receiving the recognition he sought. The American government never publicly acknowledged his role in stopping Operation Pastorius. The German government never forgave him for betraying the mission. He existed in a liminal space, belonging nowhere, accepted by no one. But here's the unexpected truth that emerged decades after Dash's death. Research by historians and intelligence analysts revealed that the Abwehr, German military intelligence, may have known Operation Pastorius was doomed before it even started. Admiral Canaris, the Abwehr chief, was secretly opposed to Hitler. He would eventually be executed for his role in a plot to assassinate the Führer. Some evidence suggests that Canaris deliberately chose men for Operation Pastorius who were likely to fail or defect. He gave them inadequate training. He selected individuals with American sympathies. He may have been deliberately sabotaging Hitler's plans. If this is true, then George Dash wasn't just a man who had a change of heart. He was part of a larger pattern of resistance within German intelligence. He was doing exactly what Canaris hoped he would do. But nobody told Dash this. He made his decision alone, believing he was betraying his mission and his country. The courage it took to make that choice, to walk into FBI headquarters and confess everything, remains real, regardless of whether Canaris anticipated it. Dash lived with the weight of that decision for 50 years, never knowing he might have been part of a hidden rebellion within the Nazi military apparatus. The story of Operation Pastorius raises uncomfortable questions about loyalty, identity, and choice. What do you owe to a country that sent you on a suicide mission? What do you owe to a country that takes credit for your sacrifice and then forgets you? Dash was born in Germany but lived in America for nearly 2 decades. He spoke English fluently. He knew American culture. He had friends in New York. When Germany recalled him and trained him as a saboteur, where did his real loyalty lie? He made a choice in a Manhattan hotel room that saved lives and ended his own chance at belonging to either nation. That kind of moral courage deserves to be remembered, even if history has largely forgotten it. The 6 executed saboteurs also deserve a moment of reflection. They were men caught up in forces larger than themselves. Some were true believers in the Nazi cause. Others were simply following orders. They had families in Germany who would suffer if they refused the mission. They had been promised glory and instead found electric chairs in a Washington jail. Their executions were legally justified under the laws of war, but they remain human tragedies, young men who made terrible choices and paid the ultimate price. Operation Pastorius stands as a reminder that war is fought not just on battlefields, but in the shadows, in hotel rooms, on foggy beaches, in the moral choices individuals make when nobody is watching. It's a story about the thin line between hero and traitor, about how history is written by those who survive, about how the truth can remain buried for decades. Most importantly, it's about a man who looked at what he was about to do and decided that some lines should never be crossed, even if crossing them means losing everything. George Dash saved America from what could have been its first major terrorist attack. He prevented factories from exploding, bridges from collapsing, trains from derailing. He stopped a campaign of terror before it began. And he died forgotten in a country that considered him a traitor, having been erased from the history of the country he saved. That's not justice. That's not recognition. That's just the cold reality of how history treats those who don't fit neat narratives. But now you know the story. You know what German spies said when they landed on American soil. You know about the young Coast Guardsmen who let them pass. You know about the FBI's manufactured narrative. You know about the secret trial and swift executions. You know about the man who turned himself in and spent the rest of his life paying for that choice. And maybe, in knowing this story, in sharing it, we give George Dash something he never got in life. The recognition that he made a choice that mattered, that saved lives, that changed history. He deserves to be remembered not as a footnote or a curiosity, but as a man who faced an impossible moral dilemma and chose humanity over loyalty, consequences over obedience, truth over survival. That's courage. That's the real story of Operation Pastorius. And it's a story that, 8 decades later, still has something vital to teach us about who we are and what we're capable of when everything is on the line.